Welcome to Bedtime Express, your journey to peaceful sleep through the gentle art of storytelling. I'm your narrator for tonight's restful voyage into history and dreams. Tonight, we travel back to ancient Rome, to a time when virtue meant more than victory, and when true strength was measured not by what a man could take, but by what he chose to give away. You'll hear the extraordinary tale of Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, a simple farmer who became Rome's savior, wielded absolute power for just 16 days, and then did something that changed the course of history forever. This is a story of courage and wisdom, of battles fought and won, but most importantly, of a man who understood that the greatest victory is knowing when to walk away. Our 3-hour journey unfolds in 5 gentle chapters, told in the slow, dreamy cadence, perfect for drifting off to peaceful slumber. Before you fall asleep, please take a moment to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to Bedtime Express for more restful journeys through history's most inspiring tales. Your support helps us continue bringing you these peaceful escapes from the busy world. Now, find your most comfortable position, close your eyes, and let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of our tale. Allow yourself to drift back through the centuries to golden fields of grain and marble columns gleaming in Mediterranean sunlight. Let the worries of today fade away as we begin our story of the farmer who saved Rome. Sleep well, dear listeners. Your dreams await in ancient fields where virtue grows eternal harvests. Cincinnatus, the reluctant dictator of Rome. In the gentle hills beyond the 7 sacred stones of Rome, where the Tiber River curved like a silver ribbon through fields of golden grain, there lived a man whose hands knew the honest weight of soil. His name was Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus. Though the earth he tended cared nothing for titles or the echoes of patrician lineage. Here, in the quiet hours before dawn, when mist rose from the furrows like the breath of sleeping gods, Cincinnatus would walk among his crops with the measured gait of one who understood that all great things grow slowly in their own time. The year was 458 before the Common Era, and Rome was still young, still finding its voice among the chorus of nations that dotted the Mediterranean like scattered pearls. The Republic, that grand experiment in shared governance, was barely 50 years old, a child in the lifespan of civilizations, yet already bearing the weight of ambitions that stretched beyond the horizon. In those days, when the morning sun painted the forum's marble columns in shades of honey and gold, senators would debate the fate of peoples they had never met, in lands they had never seen. But Cincinnatus knew a different kind of power, the power of patience, of seasons turning, of seeds planted in faith and tended with devotion. His farm was modest by the standards of his patrician peers, 4 jugera of land, roughly 2.5 acres, that he worked with his own hands. There were no vast estates here, no armies of slaves bent beneath the weight of harvest baskets. Instead, there was something rarer still: contentment. Each morning, as the first light crept across his fields, Cincinnatus would emerge from his simple dwelling, a man of 60 years whose body bore the honest scars of labor. His hands were broad and calloused, stained with the rich earth that fed Rome's growing appetite. His face, weathered by sun and wind, carried the kind of wisdom that comes not from scrolls or rhetoric, but from watching the eternal dance between seed and soil, rain and harvest. In the city, 20 miles to the southwest, his name was spoken with a mixture of respect and puzzlement. Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, former consul, veteran of Senate debates, descendant of a line that traced its roots to the very founding of the Republic. Yet here he was, choosing the plow over politics, the whisper of wind through grain over the clash of oratory in the forum. Some called it madness, this retreat from power. Others whispered of a different kind of strength, the strength to know when enough was enough. The truth, as truth so often does, lay somewhere in between. Cincinnatus had not fled Rome. He had chosen his battlefield. While others sought to shape the Republic through words and alliances, he had decided to nurture it from its very roots, the land that fed its people, the soil that anchored its foundations. Every furrow he plowed was a line drawn in defense of Roman virtue. Every harvest he gathered was a victory against hunger and want. In his small way, with his calloused hands and sun-darkened skin, he was serving Rome as surely as any general who ever led a legion across the Alps. But even as he worked his fields in quiet anonymity, the Republic was changing around him. New enemies pressed at the borders, their ambitions as vast as their armies. The Aequi, mountain warriors from the east, had grown bold in their raids against Roman territory. Their leader, a chieftain named Gracchus Cloelius, had tasted Roman gold and found it sweet. Trade routes that had once been as safe as Roman highways now echoed with the hoofbeats of raiders. Merchant caravans traveled with armed escorts, and even then, many never reached their destinations. In the Senate House, beneath the painted eagles that watched over Rome's deliberations like guardian spirits, the debate grew heated. Some called for negotiation, for treaties that might buy peace with tribute. Others demanded war, immediate and total, to remind the world that Rome's eagles cast long shadows. But compromise, that most Roman of virtues, seemed as distant as the mountain peaks where the Aequi made their strongholds. The consuls, those twin pillars of republican authority, found themselves pulling in opposite directions, their unity fractured by the weight of crisis. Miles away from these debates, Cincinnatus continued his eternal dialogue with the earth. He planted his winter wheat as his father had taught him, and his father's father before, that seed scattered by hand in rows as straight as a Roman road, each one placed with the care of a mother tucking her child into bed. The work was meditation, each motion a prayer offered to the gods who governed harvest and home. Ceres, goddess of grain, who taught humanity the art of cultivation. Terminus, guardian of boundaries, who blessed the honest limits of a man's domain. These were the deities he served now, not the fickle gods of politics and power. Yet even in this pastoral paradise, shadows began to lengthen. News traveled slowly in those days, carried by foot and horse along dusty roads, but it traveled nonetheless. A merchant, pausing to water his mule at Cincinnatus's well, spoke of Roman patrols that had failed to return from their circuits. A wandering priest, seeking shelter for the night, whispered of smoke rising from farmsteads closer to the mountains. The Equi were growing bolder, their raids reaching deeper into Roman territory with each passing moon. Still, Cincinnatus worked. There was something defiant in his persistence, something profoundly Roman in his refusal to let fear dictate his action. Each morning, he rose with the sun and walked among his crops, checking for signs of growth, for the tender green shoots that would, in time, become the bread that fed Rome's children. Each evening, he would return to his simple dwelling, wash the day's honest dirt from his hands, and share a meal with his wife, Rasilia, a woman whose quiet strength had anchored their life together for more than 30 years. Rasilia understood her husband in ways that the Senate never had. She saw past the weathered exterior to the man who had once commanded legions, who had spoken in the forum with a voice that could silence a crowd of thousands. She knew that his retreat to the farm was not surrender, but strategy, not weakness, but wisdom. In choosing to till the soil, Cincinnatus had chosen to serve Rome in the most fundamental way possible, by ensuring that it would endure not through conquest but through cultivation, not through dominion but through the daily miracle of growth. Their evenings together were gentle affairs, marked by the kind of conversation that only comes after decades of shared life. They would speak of small things, the progress of the crops, the health of their animals, the changing patterns of the weather. But beneath these mundane exchanges lay a deeper current, an understanding that they were living through history, that the choices they made, however humble, would ripple forward through time. Rome was not just the marble columns and bronze statues of the city. It was also this farmhouse, this table where they shared their simple meals, this bed where they slept beneath stars that had watched over Roman dreams for generations. On quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the grain like whispered secrets, Cincinnatus would sometimes find himself remembering his days in the Senate. The weight of the toga, heavy with tradition and expectation, the echo of his own voice in the chamber, arguing for policies he believed would serve the Republic's highest ideals. the intricate dance of alliance and opposition that governed Roman politics, each senator a player in a game whose rules stretched back to the city's founding. He did not miss it exactly, but he understood its importance, the way a farmer understands the necessity of both rain and sunshine. What he had learned in those years of public service was something that could not be taught in schools or written in treatises. True leadership was not about commanding others, but about mastering oneself. It was not about acquiring power, but about knowing when to use it, and more importantly, when to lay it down. The Republic's greatest danger was not external enemies, though they were real and pressing. Its greatest danger was internal, the corruption that came when citizens began to see public service as private opportunity, when the common good became secondary to personal ambition. These thoughts would come to him in the quiet hours, when the world seemed balanced on the edge between day and night, between what was and what might be. He would stand at his window, looking out over fields that stretched toward the distant glow of Rome, and wonder what kind of city his grandchildren would inherit. Would it still be a republic governed by citizens who understood that their first duty was to something larger than themselves? Or would it become something else? An empire, perhaps, vast and powerful but hollow at its core, like a magnificent temple built on foundations of sand. But dawn always came, bringing with it the simple certainty of work to be done, and Cincinnatus would take up his tools once more, stepping into fields still wet with dew, breathing air scented with the promise of harvest. Each day was a small victory against chaos, each planted seed an act of faith in the future. This was his contribution to Rome's story, as vital as any law passed in the Forum, as important as any battle won on distant shores. He was teaching by example what it meant to be a Roman citizen, not through grand gestures or public proclamations, but through the quiet dignity of honest work, honestly done. The seasons turned as seasons do, indifferent to human ambition, yet intimately connected to human survival. Spring brought the tender green of new growth, summer the deep satisfaction of cultivation, autumn the golden reward of harvest. And with each cycle, Cincinnatus grew more deeply rooted in his chosen life, more convinced that he had found his true calling in the furrows of his small but precious plot of earth. He was, in his quiet way, one of Rome's greatest success stories, a man who had tasted power and found it less satisfying than the honest weight of grain in his hands. Yet, even as he cultivated his peaceful existence, forces beyond his control were stirring. In the Senate House, the debates grew more urgent, as reports arrived of Aequi raids growing bolder and more coordinated. What had begun as isolated attacks on remote farmsteads was evolving into something more systematic, more dangerous. The mountain warriors were no longer content with quick strikes and hasty retreats. They were establishing camps in Roman territory, building fortifications, acting less like raiders and more like conquerors. The crisis demanded action, but the Republic's careful system of checks and balances, designed to prevent any single person from accumulating too much power, was proving inadequate to the challenge. The consuls, elected for one-year terms and required to act in concert, found themselves paralyzed by disagreement. One favored a defensive strategy, pulling Roman forces back to protect the most vital territories. The other argued for an aggressive campaign to drive the Aequi back to their mountain strongholds. While they debated, Roman blood soaked into Roman soil, and the enemy grew stronger with each passing day. It was in this atmosphere of crisis and indecision that certain senators began to whisper a word that had not been heard in Rome for 16 years. Dictator. It was a title that carried the weight of desperate times, a constitutional provision for moments when the Republic's careful balance of power became a liability rather than an asset. In extraordinary circumstances, the Senate could appoint a single man to wield absolute authority for a period not to exceed 6 months. The dictator would have power over life and death, over war and peace, over the very destiny of Rome itself. But who could be trusted with such authority? The office of dictator was perhaps the Republic's greatest test of virtue, for it required a man capable not only of wielding ultimate power, but of surrendering it when his task was complete. History was littered with the wreckage of republics that had placed their trust in strong men who had proven too fond of strength. The senators knew their Roman history, knew the stories of kings who had been overthrown because they had forgotten that their power came from the people they served. As the debate intensified, one name began to surface with increasing frequency: 5. Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, former consul, proven administrator, descendant of one of Rome's founding families. But more than his credentials, it was his character that recommended him. Here was a man who had voluntarily withdrawn from public life, who had chosen the simple rewards of honest labor over the complex satisfactions of political maneuvering. If anyone could be trusted to accept ultimate power, and then when the crisis passed, to lay that power down, it was the farmer who had already shown that he valued peace more than prestige. And so, as winter tightened its grip on the 7 hills and the Aequi prepared for their spring campaign, messengers were dispatched from Rome. They rode hard through the frozen countryside, their horses' breath forming clouds in the cold air, carrying with them a summons that would change the course of history. They rode toward a small farm beyond the city's reach, toward a man who had no idea that fate was galloping toward him on pounding hooves. They rode toward Cincinnatus, who was, at that very moment, preparing his fields for another season of quiet cultivation, unaware that Rome's greatest crisis was about to become his greatest test. The ancient world held its breath, though it did not know it yet. In Athens, Philosophers debated the nature of justice and virtue, never suspecting that both were about to be defined by a Roman farmer's calloused hands. In Persia, the great king counted his treasures, not knowing that true wealth was about to be demonstrated by a man who measured his riches in acres and bushels rather than gold and silver. And in Rome itself, citizens went about their daily business, trading in the markets, worshipping in the temples, raising their children, and building their lives, unaware that their future hung in the balance of one man's choice between power and principle. Chapter 1 was ending, though the players in this drama did not yet know it. Soon, very soon, the quiet farmer would be called to center stage in history's greatest theater. Soon, the man who had chosen obscurity would be thrust into a spotlight that would burn for centuries. Soon Cincinnatus would face the test that would make his name synonymous with virtue itself, the test of absolute power and the wisdom to surrender it. But for now, in these last quiet moments before destiny arrived at his door, he was simply a man at peace with his choices, content in his small corner of a vast and complicated world. The wind continued to rustle through his grain, carrying with it the sense of earth and growing things, the eternal promise of harvest to come. And Cincinnatus slept the deep sleep of the just, dreaming perhaps of spring planting and autumn plenty, unaware that he was about to become the answer to a prayer he had never heard, the solution to a crisis he had tried his best to avoid. History was about to knock on his door, and when he answered, the world would never be quite the same again. The morning of the 16th day of Quinctilis dawned clear and bright, with the kind of golden light that seemed to promise nothing but peace and plenty. Cincinnatus rose as he always did, with the sun, his body moving through the familiar rhythms of a life built around the eternal cycles of the earth. He stepped outside his modest dwelling and breathed deeply of the morning air, scented with the sweet fragrance of ripening grain and the earthy richness of soil that had been tended with love and patience. This day would be like so many others, a day of honest work, of small satisfactions, of the quiet contentment that came from living in harmony with the natural world. Or so he thought. Rasilia was already preparing the morning meal when he returned from his first inspection of the fields, her movements as graceful and economical as those of a dancer who had been performing the same beautiful routine for 30 years. She looked up as he entered, noting the satisfaction in his weathered face, the way his shoulders carried themselves when he was pleased with what he had seen in his domain. The wheat was coming along nicely, he told her, and the barley showed promise of an exceptional harvest. It would be a good year, perhaps a very good year. They spoke of these things in the comfortable shorthand of long marriage, each understanding meanings that went far deeper than the simple words they used. But as they shared their simple breakfast of bread and cheese, with honey from their own hives and milk from their small herd of goats, something in the distance caught Cincinnatus's attention. A cloud of dust on the road that led from Rome, moving faster than any merchant's cart or farmer's wagon. He watched it approach with the mild curiosity of a man whose days were usually marked by the gentle rhythm of seasonal change rather than the urgency of unexpected arrivals. Perhaps it was a messenger with news from the city, or a traveler seeking directions to some distant destination. In any case, it was not his concern. His world was bounded by the edges of his fields, and whatever happened beyond those boundaries belonged to other men, other lives. But the dust cloud did not pass by his farm as he expected. Instead, it turned toward his small dwelling, resolving itself into 3 horses bearing riders who wore the unmistakable toga praetexta of Roman magistrates. Cincinnatus felt something cold settle in his stomach, a premonition that his peaceful morning was about to be shattered like a clay pot dropped on stone. Official visitors at this hour could mean only one thing: the Republic had need of him once more. The lead rider dismounted with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to official ceremonies, his toga perfectly arranged despite the hard ride from Rome. Cincinnatus recognized him immediately. Marcus Junius Brutus, a senator whose family had helped establish the Republic half a century earlier. Behind him came 2 younger men, both bearing the insignia of praetors, their faces grave with the weight of their mission. They had ridden through the night, Cincinnatus realized, their urgency written in the foam on their horses' flanks and the dust that caked their normally immaculate togas. Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, Brutus began, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official proclamation. I greet you in the name of the Senate and people of Rome. Cincinnatus set down the cup from which he had been drinking, his movements deliberate and controlled. And I greet you, Marcus Junius, though I confess myself curious about what brings 3 magistrates to my humble farm at such an early hour. I hope no ill has befallen the Republic. The senator's expression grew even more solemn, if such a thing were possible. I fear that ill has indeed befallen Rome, my friend, and it is for that reason we have sought you out. The Aequi have surrounded a Roman army on Mount Algidus, trapping our soldiers like wild game in a hunter's snare. Consul Minucius Esquilinus led 4 legions against them, thinking to end their raids with a single decisive blow. Instead, he has delivered our finest soldiers into enemy hands. Even now, they face starvation and slaughter, while their enemies grow stronger with each passing hour. The words hit Cincinnatus like physical blows. 4 legions, nearly 20,000 men, the flower of Roman youth, trapped and helpless, while politicians in the city debated strategy. He could picture the scene all too clearly. Brave soldiers huddled behind hastily erected defenses, their supplies dwindling, their hope fading with each sunset that brought no sign of relief. These were not abstract numbers in some military dispatch. They were sons and fathers, brothers and friends, men who had answered Rome's call only to find themselves abandoned on a distant mountainside. "What does the Senate propose to do about this disaster?" Cincinnatus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The Senate proposes to place the fate of the Republic in your hands," Brutus replied, reaching into the folds of his toga to withdraw a scroll sealed with the official seal of Rome. "By unanimous vote, you have been named dictator of Rome, with absolute authority to act as you see fit to preserve the Republic and rescue our trapped legions. The sacred fasces await your command, and every citizen from the humblest plebeian to the most patrician senator will obey your word as law." The scroll seemed to weigh more than a marble block as Cincinnatus took it in his calloused hands. Dictator. The word echoed in his mind like thunder in an empty valley. Ultimate power, absolute authority, the destiny of Rome itself placed in his keeping. It was everything he had spent the last 16 years trying to escape, everything he had rejected when he chose the quiet life of a farmer over the glittering temptations of political ambition. He looked down at the scroll, its wax seal bearing the eagle of Rome, that proud bird whose wings cast shadows over half the known world. With his thumb he could break that seal and accept a burden that would transform him from a simple farmer into the most powerful man in the Mediterranean. Or he could hand it back, return to his plowing, and let other men grapple with the Republic's crisis. The choice was his, and his alone. "You honor me with your trust," he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "But I must ask, why me? Surely there are younger men, more recent in their military experience, better suited to the demands of command in the field. I am 60 years old, Marcus Junius, a farmer who has not held a sword in earnest for more years than I care to count." Brutus stepped forward, his eyes meeting those of the man he had come to summon. "It is precisely because you are that farmer that we seek you out, Cincinnatus. Rome has no shortage of ambitious men who would gladly accept the power we offer. What it lacks, what it desperately needs, is a man who values the Republic more than his own advancement, who understands that true strength lies not in grasping power, but in knowing when to release it. You have already proven that you can walk away from authority when duty to Rome required it. Now we ask you to prove that you can take it up again for the same reason." From inside the house, Rucilia had been listening to this extraordinary conversation, her woman's intuition telling her that their quiet life was about to be shattered like glass in a hailstorm. She emerged now, moving to stand beside her husband, her presence a reminder of all that he would be leaving behind if he accepted this burden. Yet when she spoke, her words carried not protest but understanding. "The choice is yours, husband," she said simply. "But 20,000 Roman soldiers are looking toward Rome for salvation, and Rome is looking toward you. Whatever you decide, I will stand by you. as I have for 30 years. But do not let fear of losing what we have built here prevent you from doing what honor demands." Cincinnatus looked at his wife, seeing in her weathered face the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime spent in devotion to duty and family. Then he looked out over his fields, golden in the morning sun, representing everything he had worked to build and preserve. Finally, he looked at the 3 magistrates who had ridden through the night to bring him this burden, their faces grave with the weight of Rome's need. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice than like a recognition of inevitability. He had been a Roman citizen before he was a farmer, a servant of the Republic before he was a servant of the soil. His retreat to this peaceful farm had never been a rejection of that duty, merely a different way of fulfilling it. Now Rome called him to serve in a different capacity, and to refuse would be to betray everything he had spent his life believing. With deliberate care, he broke the wax seal and unrolled the parchment. The Latin phrases were formal and ancient, their very rhythms carrying the weight of centuries of Roman law and custom. Senatus Populusque Romanus. It began the Senate and people of Rome and continued with the formula that had been used only 5 times before in the Republic's history to invest a single man with absolute power. As he read, Cincinnatus felt the mantle of authority settling around his shoulders like a heavy cloak, transforming him from private citizen to supreme commander, with words written on parchment. "I accept," he said simply, rolling up the scroll and tucking it into his belt. "But understand this, gentlemen. I accept not because I seek power, but because Rome requires service, and service is the debt every citizen owes to the Republic. I will take up the fasces, but only until this crisis has passed. When the Aequi are defeated and our legions are safe, I will lay down this authority as readily as I took it up and return to my proper place behind the plow." The transformation was immediate and almost mystical. One moment he had been Cincinnatus the farmer, a man whose greatest concern was the ripening of his grain. The next, he was dictator of Rome, wielding power that kings would envy and emperors would covet. The magistrates who had come to summon him now looked upon him with the deference due to supreme authority, while he himself felt the weight of 20,000 lives settling upon his shoulders like a burden made of lead. "What forces are immediately available?" he asked, his mind already shifting from the concerns of agriculture to the demands of military strategy. "2 legions remain in the city," replied one of the praetors, "along with the urban cohorts and such auxiliary forces as can be quickly mustered. But they are largely untested troops, hastily recruited to replace those now trapped on Mount Algidus. The veterans, the backbone of our military strength, are either besieged with minutiae or scattered in garrison duties throughout the Republic." Cincinnatus nodded grimly. It was worse than he had hoped, but no worse than he had feared. The Aequi had timed their trap well, striking when Rome's military strength was divided and her best soldiers were far from home. But if the enemy thought they faced a republic weakened by political division and military disaster, they would soon learn otherwise. Rome's greatest strength had never been her professional legions, formidable though they were. Her greatest strength was the spirit of her citizens, their willingness to sacrifice comfort and safety for the greater good of the Republic. "Send word to the city immediately," he commanded, his voice taking on the tone of absolute authority. "All able-bodied men between the ages of 17 and 60 are to present themselves for military service at dawn tomorrow. Those who have served before will be formed into cohorts under their former officers. Those who have not will be organized into new units under such veterans as we can spare from the urban legions. Every blacksmith, every carpenter, every tradesman whose skills might serve the army is to be conscripted immediately. We will march within 3 days, or 20,000 Romans will die on a mountainside while we debate preparations." The magistrates exchanged glances, perhaps startled by the speed and decisiveness of his commands. This was not the deliberative process of the Senate, where every decision was debated and refined through countless speeches and amendments. This was something Rome had not seen for 16 years, the focused will of a single man backed by the full authority of the state. It was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, like watching lightning strike in a clear sky. But there was no time for philosophical reflection on the nature of power and its uses. Even as they spoke, the trapped legions on Mount Algidus were consuming their dwindling supplies, while the Aequi tightened their stranglehold and prepared for the final assault that would eliminate a quarter of Rome's military strength. Every hour of delay meant more Roman blood soaking into foreign soil, more families that would receive the terrible news that their sons and fathers would never return home. "I will need to return to Rome immediately," Cincinnatus continued, his farmer's practical mind already grappling with the logistics of transforming civilians into soldiers. "But first, I must settle my affairs here and take leave of my wife. A man who cannot govern his own household has no business governing a republic." He turned to Ricilia, who had been standing silently beside him, her face composed but her eyes reflecting the pain of impending separation. For 30 years, they had shared the quiet rhythms of farm life, the simple pleasures of seasons turning and harvests gathered. Now duty was calling him back to a world of violence and politics, back to the burden of making decisions that would echo through history. "How long?" she asked simply. "I do not know," he replied with the honesty that had always characterized their relationship. "Long enough to save our soldiers and defeat our enemies. Not a day longer than necessity demands. The Republic can command my service, but it cannot command my heart that remains here, with you, in these fields we have tended together." They embraced then, two people who understood that love sometimes demanded sacrifice, that devotion to each other could not override devotion to the common good. Rasilia had married a Roman citizen, a man whose ultimate loyalty belonged not to himself or even to her, but to the republic that had given meaning to both their lives. She had always known this day might come, had accepted it as part of the price of loving a man of honor. Within the hour, Cincinnatus had exchanged his simple farmer's tunic for the toga of office, its purple stripe marking him as one invested with imperium, the sacred authority to command armies and govern peoples. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The weathered farmer seemed to shed years along with his work clothes, his posture straightening, his voice taking on the resonant authority of command. Yet, beneath the external trappings of power, he remained essentially himself, a man who understood that true strength came from service rather than domination. As his horse was prepared for the journey to Rome, Cincinnatus took one final walk through his fields. The wheat rustled in the morning breeze, golden and heavy with promise, ready for harvest in just a few weeks' time. He paused to run his fingers through the grain, feeling its texture, inhaling its sweet fragrance. This was what he was fighting for. He realized not abstract concepts of glory or empire, but the simple right of Roman farmers to tend their crops in peace, to raise their children in safety, to build their lives without fear of foreign raiders or political tyrants. The ride to Rome passed in contemplative silence, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of hooves on the ancient stone road and the occasional exchange of information about the military situation. As they crested each hill, the eternal city revealed more of herself. First, the smoke of cooking fires rising from 1,000 hearths, then the gleam of marble temples catching the afternoon sun. Finally, the bustle of the streets themselves as citizens went about their daily business, unaware that their fate was being carried toward them by a farmer-turned-dictator. The news of Cincinnatus's appointment had preceded them, spreading through Rome's streets like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Citizens gathered along the roadway to catch a glimpse of the man who would either save the Republic or preside over its destruction. Some remembered him from his days as consul, nodding their approval at the Senate's choice. Others knew him only by reputation, the patrician who had chosen poverty over politics, virtue over advancement. All sensed that they were witnessing a moment of historical significance, though none could predict exactly what that significance would prove to be. As they entered the Forum, that sacred heart of Roman public life, Cincinnatus felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon him. Here Brutus had established the Republic after overthrowing the last king. Here generations of consuls had taken their oaths of office, swearing to preserve and protect the Roman people. Here, in just a few moments, he would receive the fasces that would make him the most powerful man in the known world. The irony was not lost on him. Power beyond measure was about to be placed in the hands of the one man in Rome who least desired it. The ceremony was brief and solemn, conducted according to rituals that stretched back to the city's founding. The lictors, those ceremonial guards who carried the fasces, approached with measured steps, their faces grave with the importance of the moment. The fasces themselves, bundles of rods bound around an axe, symbolized the power to punish and the power to execute, the ultimate authority that the Roman people were placing in Cincinnatus's keeping. As the chief lictor placed them in his hands, a hush fell over the assembled crowd, as if all Rome was holding its breath. "Citizens of Rome," Cincinnatus began, his voice carrying clearly across the forum, "you have honored me with your trust and burdened me with your hopes. I accept both gladly, not for my own glory, but for the safety of our trapped legions and the preservation of our republic. The Aequi believe they have dealt Rome a mortal blow, that we are a people too soft and divided to respond to their challenge. They will learn otherwise. Before this moon has waned, our soldiers will be free, and our enemies will rue the day they dared to shed Roman blood." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Cincinnatus raised his hand for silence. "I call upon every citizen to serve according to his ability. The young and strong will take up arms and march with me to Mount Algidus. The old and wise will remain to guard the city and manage our affairs. The women and children will provision our forces and pray to the gods for victory. All Rome must unite if we are to triumph over this threat. Divided, we are vulnerable to any enemy. United, we are unconquerable." As night fell over the 7 hills, Rome hummed with unprecedented activity. In workshops and armories throughout the city, craftsmen worked by lamplight to forge weapons and repair equipment. In homes from the humblest insulae to the most palatial villas, families said their farewells as sons and fathers prepared to answer the call to arms. In temples throughout the city, priests offered prayers and sacrifices to Mars, god of war, and to Victoria, goddess of victory, beseeching the divine powers to smile upon Roman arms. Cincinnatus himself slept little that first night, poring over maps and dispatches by candlelight, trying to understand the tactical situation that awaited him on Mount Algidus. The mountain was a natural fortress, its slopes steep and treacherous, its summit commanding views of all the surrounding countryside. The Aequi had chosen their ground well, forcing any relief force to attack uphill while they held the high ground. Worse still, they had managed to surround the Roman forces so completely that no word had come from Consul Minucius for days. For all Cincinnatus knew, the legions he was marching to save had already been annihilated. But doubt was a luxury he could not afford. 20,000 Roman lives hung in the balance, and with them the Republic's reputation for protecting its own. If Rome's enemies learned that Roman soldiers could be trapped and slaughtered with impunity, if they discovered that the Republic lacked the will to rescue its own legions, then every border would erupt in rebellion, every alliance would crumble, every treaty would become worthless parchment. This was more than a military crisis. It was a test of Roman character, a moment that would define the Republic's future for generations to come. Dawn came to Rome like a clarion call, its golden light falling upon a city transformed by the urgency of war. The streets that had been quiet the evening before now echoed with the tramp of marching feet, the clatter of arms being distributed, the voices of officers calling their new recruits into formation. Citizens who had gone to bed as merchants and farmers and craftsmen were awakening as soldiers of the Republic, ready to shed their blood on distant mountains for the sake of brothers they had never met. Cincinnatus stood on the steps of the Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, watching this miraculous transformation unfold before his eyes. In less than 18 hours, Rome had mobilized more completely than most armies could manage in as many days. The secret lay not in superior organization or equipment, though both were adequate, but in something far more precious: the understanding that citizenship was not merely a privilege to be enjoyed, but a responsibility to be shouldered. Every man presenting himself for service understood that he was not just serving Rome, he was Rome, part of an unbroken chain of duty and sacrifice that stretched back to the city's legendary founding. The new recruits were a remarkable sight to behold, representing every stratum of Roman society. Grizzled veterans of earlier campaigns stood shoulder to shoulder with boys barely old enough to lift a gladius. Wealthy merchants who could afford the finest armor found themselves in ranks beside poor farmers whose only protection was determination and a wooden shield. Slaves who had earned their freedom through faithful service marched alongside patricians whose ancestors had signed the treaties that established the Republic. In this moment of crisis, the rigid social hierarchies that normally governed Roman life seemed to dissolve, replaced by the simpler and more fundamental distinction between citizen and enemy. Among the new soldiers, Cincinnatus recognized faces from his years in the Senate, men he had debated with in the Forum, now preparing to follow him into battle. There was Marcus Crassus, whose grandfather had helped establish the Republic's financial system, now buckling on a sword he had not worn since his youth. There was Gaius Valerius, a successful wine merchant whose business would suffer from his absence, but whose conscience would not permit him to profit while others bled for Rome. There was young Lucius Junius, barely 18 but already showing the quiet dignity that marked him as future leadership material. Each face told a story of sacrifice willingly undertaken, of private concerns set aside for the public good. But it was not only men who were mobilizing for Rome's cause. Throughout the city, Women were organizing themselves with the same efficiency their husbands and sons were showing on the parade grounds. In every neighborhood, they were gathering supplies, food for the march, bandages for the wounded, oil for the lamps that would burn through the long nights of preparation. Wealthy matrons opened their stores of grain and wine, while poor women contributed whatever they could spare from their modest households. Even the children were involved, running messages between different parts of the city, helping to carry equipment, doing whatever their small hands could manage to support the great endeavor. The scene reminded Cincinnatus of nothing so much as a harvest, when every member of a farming community would come together to bring in the grain before the weather turned. There was the same sense of urgency, the same understanding that individual convenience must give way to collective necessity. But where a harvest promised life and sustenance, this mobilization promised death and glory and the chance, if the gods were willing, to save 20,000 Roman lives from destruction. As the morning wore on, reports began reaching Cincinnatus from his scouts and spies, painting a picture of the situation on Mount Algidus that was both better and worse than he had feared. The good news was that Consul Minucius and his legions were still alive, still holding their positions despite increasingly desperate circumstances. The bad news was that their situation was deteriorating rapidly, with supplies running so low that they were rationing water and eating their pack animals to stave off starvation. More ominously still, the Aequi had been reinforced during the night, their own allies arriving from mountain strongholds throughout the region. The enemy force now numbered close to 40,000 warriors, nearly twice the size of the army Cincinnatus was assembling. They held commanding positions on the mountain slopes, had ample supplies secured in caves and hidden valleys, and possessed the kind of intimate knowledge of the terrain that came from generations of fighting in these rugged hills. Any conventional assault would be suicidal, a repetition of the mistake that had trapped Minucius in the first place. Victory, if it was to be achieved at all, would require not just courage but cunning, not just strength but strategy. Cincinnatus spent the midday hours closeted with his senior officers, poring over every scrap of intelligence they had managed to gather about the mountain and its approaches. The Aequi had made their camp in a natural amphitheater near the summit, a bowl-shaped valley that provided shelter from the wind and multiple escape routes if the battle turned against them. The Roman legions were trapped on a lower ridge, surrounded by enemy positions that commanded every possible avenue of retreat. Any relief force approaching by the obvious routes would be spotted hours before it could reach the battlefield, giving the Aequi ample time to prepare their defenses or simply complete the slaughter of their captives before turning to meet the new threat. But as Cincinnatus studied the rough maps his scouts had sketched, an idea began to form in his mind, desperate, risky, but perhaps just audacious enough to succeed. The Aequi had positioned themselves to defend against a conventional attack from the valley below. the route that any Roman commander would logically choose. What they had not anticipated was an assault from above, from the mountain's highest peaks where no sane general would think to lead an army. The terrain was treacherous, the path uncertain, the risk of losing half his force to accidents and exposure enormous. But if it worked, if his men could somehow reach the heights undetected and strike down at the enemy from an unexpected direction, they might achieve the kind of surprise that could turn 40,000 enemies into 40,000 fugitives. "It's madness," declared one of his senior centurions, a grizzled veteran named Marcus Flavius, whose scars told the story of 20 years' service on Rome's frontiers. "The climb alone will kill a quarter of our men, and that's assuming the enemy doesn't spot us halfway up the mountain. We'll be strung out over miles of rocky terrain, unable to maintain formation, vulnerable to counterattack at any point." "All of that is true," Cincinnatus acknowledged, his finger tracing the path he had in mind on the rough-drawn map. "But consider the alternative, Marcus Flavius. A direct assault up the lower slopes will cost us everything and save nothing. The Aequi hold every advantage of position and supply. Our only hope lies in doing what they least expect, in turning their own preparations against them. Yes, the climb is dangerous, but not as dangerous as marching straight into their prepared defenses." The debate continued through the afternoon, as Roman pragmatism warred with Roman audacity. Some officers favored a siege, surrounding the mountain and starving the enemy into submission. Others proposed dividing their forces, creating multiple diversions to confuse and divide the Aequi defenders. Each plan had merit, each had weaknesses, and all of them suffered from the same fatal flaw: they would take too long to implement. Every day they delayed was another day closer to the total destruction of Minucius's trapped legions. In the end, it was the memory of his farming days that decided Cincinnatus. He remembered watching a fox raid his chicken coop, studying the way the clever predator had found an approach that bypassed all his carefully constructed defenses. The fox had not tried to break down the strong gate or climb over the high walls. Instead, it had found a loose board in the back of the coop, a weakness so small and seemingly insignificant that no reasonable farmer would have thought to guard against it. The Aequi had built their trap with the same kind of logical thinking, protecting against every reasonable line of attack while leaving unguarded the approaches that no reasonable enemy would attempt. "We march at sunset," he announced, his decision carrying the finality of absolute authority. "Half our force will take the obvious route through the valley, making no attempt at concealment, letting the enemy see them coming. They will make camp within sight of the Aequi positions and prepare for what appears to be a dawn assault. Meanwhile, the other half will circle around through the high passes, using darkness to hide their movement. When the sun rises, the Aequi will find themselves caught between two fires, and our trapped legions will have the chance to break free and join the battle." The plan was risky beyond measure, requiring precise timing, favorable weather, and the kind of luck that soldiers pray for but seldom receive. If either column was discovered prematurely, if the weather turned bad during the night march, if any of a dozen things went wrong, the result would be catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. But if everything worked as intended, if the gods smiled on Roman arms and Roman courage, then the sun would set the next day on a field littered with enemy dead and Roman eagles flying triumphant over Mount Algidus. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, the Roman army prepared to march. Soldiers checked their equipment one final time, tightening straps and testing edges, making sure that everything was ready for the trial ahead. Officers moved among the ranks, offering quiet words of encouragement and ensuring that every man understood his role in the complex plan that would unfold over the next 24 hours. In the temples throughout Rome, priests and priestesses maintained vigil, offering continuous prayers for the success of Roman arms and the safe return of Rome's sons. Cincinnatus himself took a final moment to gaze back at the city he was leaving behind, its marble temples and brick insulae bathed in the golden light of evening. Somewhere in that maze of streets, Rosilia was sitting alone in their farmhouse, perhaps looking out toward the road that had carried her husband away to war. The harvest he had been so eager to gather would have to wait, tended by neighbors and hired hands while he fulfilled this greater duty to the Republic. But if the gods were willing, if his plans succeeded and his soldiers proved worthy of their ancestors, he would return to those peaceful fields before the grain had time to spoil in the granary. The march began in the gathering dusk, 2 columns of Roman soldiers moving out through different gates of the city like the arms of some great tactical embrace. The valley column moved openly, their armor glinting in the last rays of sunlight, their standards flying proudly, every detail of their movement calculated to draw enemy attention. The mountain column slipped away more quietly, taking narrow paths and forgotten trails, their equipment muffled and their movements concealed by the growing darkness. Cincinnatus rode with the mountain column, sharing the risks of the most dangerous part of his plan. It would have been safer, more conventional, to remain with the main force and direct operations from a secure position. But he had learned long ago that leadership meant more than giving orders from behind the lines. His soldiers were about to climb paths that mountain goats would find challenging, to fight a battle at altitudes where the air itself seemed thin and hostile. The least he could do was climb beside them, to show by his presence that no sacrifice was being asked of them that he was not willing to share. The night march tested every man's endurance to its limits. The path, if it could be called a path, wound upward through terrain that seemed designed to break both spirit and bones. Loose stones shifted underfoot with every step, threatening to send unwary soldiers tumbling into ravines whose bottoms were lost in shadow. Thorny shrubs tore at exposed skin and caught at equipment, while the ever-thinning air made every breath a conscious effort. More than once, Cincinnatus questioned the wisdom of his decision, wondering if he was leading his men to destruction rather than victory. But gradually, as the hours passed and the mountain revealed its secrets to determined climbers, something remarkable began to happen. The soldiers who had started the climb as individuals, merchants and farmers and craftsmen pressed into service, began to function as a single organism, each man helping his neighbors, sharing water and encouragement in equal measure. Veterans who had fought in a dozen campaigns found themselves taking guidance from young hunters who knew how to read the mountain's moods. City dwellers who had never walked farther than from their shops to the forum discovered reserves of strength they had not known they possessed. By the time the first pale light of dawn began to touch the eastern sky, Cincinnatus's column had achieved something that would have seemed impossible the day before. They had reached the high passes above Mount Algidus, looking down on an enemy camp that stretched below them like a map spread on a table. The Aequi warriors were indeed preparing for battle, but all their attention was focused downslope, toward the valley where Roman standards could be seen advancing in the growing light. Not one enemy sentry was looking upward toward the heights where 2,000 Roman soldiers waited like eagles preparing to dive upon their prey. The trapped legions were visible too, a small cluster of Roman fortifications on a lower ridge, surrounded by Aequi positions, but still flying their eagles defiantly. Even at this distance, Cincinnatus could see that his men were in desperate straits. Their camp was smaller than it should have been, suggesting heavy casualties, and smoke from their cooking fires was almost non-existent, indicating that they had little left to eat. But they were alive, they were still fighting, and in just a few minutes they would discover that Rome had not abandoned them after all. Cincinnatus raised his hand, and 2,000 Roman soldiers prepared to charge down a mountainside into the pages of history. In the valley below, their comrades were doing the same, advancing toward what appeared to be certain death, but was actually the opening movement of a perfectly choreographed symphony of war. And on the ridge between them, 20,000 Roman legionaries prepared to discover that their long ordeal was finally over, that the republic they had served so faithfully was about to repay their sacrifice with the sweetest gift of all, rescue and revenge. The moment before a battle begins is like no other in human experience, a crystalline instant when time seems suspended between possibility and inevitability, when the future hangs balanced on the edge of decision and chance. As Cincinnatus raised his gladius above his head, catching the first rays of morning sunlight on its polished blade, 2,000 Roman hearts beat in perfect unison. 2,000 pairs of lungs drew the thin mountain air. 2,000 minds focused on the single purpose that had brought them to this impossible place at this crucial hour. Below them, spread out like pieces on some vast gaming board, the Aequi warriors were beginning their own preparations for what they believed would be a routine slaughter. Their confidence was understandable. They held every tactical advantage, commanded every approach, possessed numerical superiority and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Their scouts had reported the approach of a Roman relief force through the valley, a force that seemed pitifully small compared to the mighty army they had assembled on Mount Algidus. What they had not reported, what their mountain-trained eyes had somehow failed to detect, was the second Roman force that now looked down upon them from the heights like the very gods of war made manifest. The signal came not with a trumpet's blare that would have warned the enemy, but with the silent flash of bronze as Cincinnatus brought his sword down in a sweeping arc. What followed was perhaps the most remarkable military maneuver in Roman history, a coordinated assault that unfolded simultaneously on 3 different levels of the mountain, turning the Aequi's carefully prepared trap into a death snare of Roman making. From the heights, Cincinnatus's column descended like an avalanche of bronze and steel, their war cries echoing off the mountain walls as they crashed into the enemy's rear positions. The Aequi warriors, caught completely by surprise, struggled to turn and face this unexpected threat while maintaining their siege positions around the trapped Roman legions. Confusion spread through their ranks like wildfire as officers shouted contradictory orders and warriors found themselves facing attacks from directions they had not even bothered to guard. Simultaneously, the Valley column launched its own assault, no longer the tentative probing attack that the Aequi had been expecting, but a full-scale charge that struck the enemy's front positions with devastating force. Roman legionnaires who had seemed to be walking into certain death suddenly revealed themselves as the disciplined killing machine that had conquered half the Mediterranean, their gladii seeking Aequi throats with mechanical precision, their shields locking together in formations that had been perfected through generations of warfare. But perhaps most remarkably of all, the trapped legions of Consul Minucius chose that exact moment to break free of their defensive positions and join the attack. These men, who had been starving and desperate just moments before, found reserves of strength they had not known they possessed when they heard the sound of Roman war cries echoing from the mountainside. Their own eagles rose once more, no longer symbols of defeat but banners of vengeance, as 20,000 supposedly beaten soldiers transformed themselves into 20,000 instruments of Roman wrath. The battle that followed was unlike anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. In most conflicts of the era, armies met in formal lines, shield wall against shield wall, with victory going to whichever side could maintain its formation longest under the grinding pressure of close combat. But this was something entirely different, a 3-dimensional dance of death that flowed across multiple levels of the mountainside, with Roman forces striking from above, below, and within, turning every equi advantage into a liability. Cincinnatus himself fought like a man possessed, his 60-year-old body moving with the fluid grace of a warrior half his age. The soft farmer's hands that had guided a plow just days before now wielded a gladius with deadly efficiency, cutting through enemy ranks as if they were nothing more than grain ready for harvest. His presence on the battlefield unmistakable in his dictator's purple-striped toga worn over military armor seemed to inspire every Roman soldier who saw him, transforming citizen soldiers into heroes worthy of their legendary ancestors. The equi fought bravely, as mountain warriors always do when cornered, but bravery alone could not overcome the tactical disaster that had befallen them. Their carefully prepared positions, designed to channel any Roman attack into killing zones, became death traps for their own forces as they found themselves surrounded and cut off from mutual support. Their numerical superiority meant nothing when they could not bring their full strength to bear at any single point. Their knowledge of the terrain proved useless when the battle flowed in directions they had never anticipated. As the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, the outcome became increasingly clear. What had begun as an equi trap was rapidly becoming an equi rout, as warrior after warrior threw down his weapons and fled toward the mountain's higher reaches, seeking any path that might lead away from the Roman killing machine that had materialized as if from thin air. But Cincinnatus had positioned his forces too well. Every escape route was covered, every bolt hole blocked by Roman steel. The very geography that had made Mount Algidus such a perfect trap for Romans now served to contain the equi in their moment of defeat. By midday, the battle was over. The mountainside that had echoed with war cries and clashing weapons just hours before now lay silent except for the moans of the wounded and the prayers of the dying. Equi bodies littered the slopes like broken dolls, testament to the price of challenging Roman determination when properly led and coordinated. Those enemy warriors who had survived the slaughter knelt in the dust with their hands bound behind them, awaiting whatever fate the victorious Romans might decree. Among the prisoners was Gracchus Clodius himself, the equi chieftain whose ambition had initiated this entire catastrophe. He was brought before Cincinnatus under heavy guard, his proud bearing somewhat diminished by the blood that trickled from a head wound and the bronze shackles that bound his wrists. Even in defeat, however, he maintained the dignity of a warrior chief, meeting the Roman dictator's gaze without flinching, prepared to die as bravely as he had lived. "You fought well," Cincinnatus acknowledged, his voice carrying no trace of mockery or gloating triumph. "Your plan was sound, your positions well chosen, your warriors brave. In other circumstances, against other enemies, you might have achieved the great victory you sought. But you made one fatal error. You underestimated what free men will do when their brothers' lives hang in the balance. Cloelius straightened despite his bonds, his dark eyes reflecting something between respect and resignation. "And what will you do with us now, Roman? Will you crucify us along your roads as warnings to others who might challenge your eagles? Will you sell us in your slave markets to purchase bronze for new statues of your victories?" The question hung in the mountain air like morning mist, while every Roman soldier within earshot waited to hear their dictator's response. It was a moment that would define not just Cincinnatus's character, but Rome's a choice between the harsh justice of conquest and the merciful wisdom that distinguished civilization from mere dominance. Around them, the rescued legions of Consul Minucius watched with the intensity of men who understood that they were witnessing history being made. "You will return to your mountain strongholds," Cincinnatus said finally, his words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You will take with you the bodies of your dead for proper burial according to your customs. You will also take with you this message: Rome does not seek to rule over unwilling subjects, but neither will she allow her citizens to be murdered with impunity. Live in peace, and you will find Rome a generous neighbor. Raise your hands against Roman citizens again, and you will discover that what happened here today was merely a taste of Roman justice." The decision sent ripples of astonishment through both armies. Roman soldiers who had expected to spend the rest of the day collecting plunder and selecting slaves found themselves instead cutting the bonds from enemy prisoners and helping to gather enemy dead for burial. Aequi warriors who had prepared themselves for death or slavery discovered that they were being offered something far more precious: the chance to return home with their honor intact and their lives restored. It was a gesture that spoke to something profound in the Roman character, the understanding that true victory lay not in destroying one's enemies, but in transforming them into friends, or at least into peaceful neighbors. Cincinnatus had learned this lesson during his years behind the plow. I had seen how a farmer who worked with nature's patterns rather than against them could achieve far greater harvests than one who tried to dominate every aspect of his environment. The same principle, he believed, applied to the art of governing peoples. Rule through fear and you create rebels. Rule through justice and you create citizens. As the afternoon wore on, the miraculous transformation of enemies into grateful departing guests continued under the supervision of Roman officers who still couldn't quite believe what they were witnessing. Enemy wounded received the same medical care as Roman casualties. Enemy dead were treated with the same respect as fallen legionnaires. Enemy survivors were provided with food and water for their journey home. It was a display of magnanimity that would echo through the mountain communities for generations, creating a reservoir of respect for Roman justice that would prove more valuable than any amount of tribute or plunder. Meanwhile, Consul Minucius was reunited with his dictator in a scene that moved even hardened veterans to tears. The consul, gaunt from his ordeal but still bearing himself with military pride, approached Cincinnatus with steps that seemed to carry the weight of all the fears and hopes his trapped legions had endured during their desperate siege. When he knelt before the dictator, protocol demanded no less. Cincinnatus immediately raised him to his feet, embracing him as one soldier embraces another after shared danger. "Rise, Minucius," the dictator said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and your men have already paid whatever price duty might demand. You held when holding seemed impossible. You fought when fighting seemed hopeless. You kept Roman eagles flying when the world expected them to fall. No dictator, no matter how absolute his authority, has the right to ask more of Roman soldiers than that." The consul's eyes, hollow from weeks of starvation and sleepless nights, filled with tears that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the relief of a man who had expected to die forgotten on a mountainside, but had instead lived to see his soldiers marching home in triumph. "We knew you would come," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Even when the food ran out, even when water became more precious than gold, we knew that Rome would not abandon us. But we never imagined to this. This victory seems touched by the gods themselves." Indeed, as word of the battle spread through the Roman ranks, there was a growing sense that they had participated in something more than a military victory. They had witnessed the transformation of certain defeat into impossible triumph, had seen their citizen soldiers perform feats that professional armies might envy. Most remarkably of all, they had seen their dictator choose mercy over vengeance, creating more loyalty through magnanimity than fear could ever have achieved. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the battlefield, Cincinnatus stood alone for a moment on the highest point of Mount Algidus, looking out over a landscape that had been transformed by the events of a single day. Where morning had revealed an enemy stronghold bristling with weapons and warriors, evening now showed a peaceful mountainside where Roman and Aqui soldiers worked side by side to honor their respective dead. The transformation seemed to symbolize something larger, the possibility that even the most bitter conflicts could be resolved through courage, wisdom, and the kind of leadership that inspired rather than commanded. His reverie was interrupted by the approach of his senior officers, men whose faces still bore the mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that follows successful battle. They came bearing reports of casualties remarkably light for such a decisive engagement, and requests for instructions regarding the disposition of captured equipment and supplies. But beneath their professional concerns, Cincinnatus could sense a deeper question, one they were too tactful to voice directly. What happened now? The crisis that had prompted his appointment as dictator was over. The trapped legions had been rescued, the enemy defeated, the immediate threat to Roman security eliminated. By any measure, his mission was complete, his duty fulfilled. Yet he now possessed power that kings would covet, absolute authority over the most formidable military machine in the Mediterranean world, backed by the grateful loyalty of soldiers who had seen him lead them to impossible victory. With such power, he could reshape Rome according to his vision, could eliminate the political divisions that had nearly led to disaster, could establish a system of government that would endure for generations. The temptation was real, more subtle than the crude ambition of would-be tyrants, but far more dangerous, precisely because it masqueraded as virtue. After all, had he not just demonstrated superior judgment to the quarreling consuls whose indecision had created this crisis? Had he not shown that effective leadership sometimes required the concentration of authority in capable hands? Would Rome not benefit from having such leadership on a permanent basis, freed from the constraints of annual elections and political compromise? 2-0. But as these thoughts flickered through his mind, Cincinnatus found himself remembering not the glory of the day's victory, but the quiet satisfaction of morning walks through his grain fields. He remembered the feel of soil between his fingers, the simple pleasure of watching seeds transform themselves into sustenance, the deep contentment that came from building rather than conquering. Power was intoxicating, but it was also corrupting, and the most insidious corruption was the one that convinced its victims they were immune to its effects. "Prepare the legions for the march back to Rome," he commanded, his voice carrying the firm decisiveness that had characterized every order he had given since accepting the dictatorship. "We leave at dawn tomorrow. The crisis is resolved. Our soldiers are safe. Our enemies have learned to respect Roman strength and Roman mercy. There is no reason to linger here when there are wives waiting at home and fields that need tending." The march back to Rome took 3 days, 3 days of triumphal progress through countryside that seemed to have been transformed by the news of victory. From every village and farm, citizens emerged to cheer the returning heroes, to shower them with flowers and wine, to touch the hem of the dictator's toga in the hope that some of his miraculous success might transfer to their own endeavors. Children ran alongside the marching columns, their eyes wide with wonder at the sight of real Roman legions in all their bronze and leather glory. Old men who remembered the Republic's earlier crises nodded approvingly as they recognized the quality of leadership that had saved their sons and grandsons from mountain graves. Yet, throughout this journey, Cincinnatus remained oddly subdued, his thoughts turning increasingly not to the glory of victory, but to the responsibilities of power and the wisdom of knowing when to lay those responsibilities down. Each mile that brought them closer to Rome also brought them closer to the moment when he would have to choose between keeping the authority that had served him so well and returning it to the people from whom it had come. It was a choice that would define not just his own legacy, but the character of the Republic itself. The army's approach to Rome was heralded by messengers who had ridden ahead to spread news of the incredible victory on Mount Algidus. The citizens of the Eternal City poured out through its gates in numbers not seen since the founding celebrations, creating a human river of celebration that stretched for miles along the approach roads. Senators who had debated for days before finally agreeing to appoint a dictator now competed with each other to claim credit for the wisdom of their choice. Merchants who had worried about the economic impact of military crisis now calculated the profits to be made from victory celebrations. Mothers who had sent their sons off to war just days earlier now wept tears of joy as they recognized familiar faces in the returning columns. But perhaps most remarkably of all, the rescued legions of Consul Minucius had somehow managed to transform their recent ordeal into a source of fierce pride. These men who had faced starvation and death on a lonely mountainside now marched as if they were conquerors returning from some distant campaign rather than victims rescued from disaster. Their standards flew as proudly as ever. Their armor had been polished to mirror brightness. Their voices joined in the ancient songs that Roman soldiers had sung since the days of the kings. In the mysterious alchemy of military culture, near defeat had been transformed into victory, desperation into glory, rescue into triumph. As they approached the gates of Rome, Cincinnatus felt the weight of history settling around him like a familiar cloak. Here, at this very spot, countless Roman heroes had returned from their victories. Horatius from his defense of the bridge, Coriolanus from his campaigns against the Volscians, 100 lesser-known but equally brave commanders who had served the Republic and then stepped back into civilian life. The tradition was clear, the precedent established. Victory belonged to Rome, not to any individual Roman, and those who served as instruments of that victory were expected to remember that they were servants, not masters. The formal entry into the city was a spectacle that would be remembered and recounted for generations. First came the rescued legions, their eagles gleaming in the afternoon sun, their step perfectly synchronized despite the ordeal they had endured. Behind them marched the citizen soldiers who had answered Rome's call, farmers and merchants and craftsmen who had proven themselves worthy inheritors of their ancestors' martial tradition. And finally, surrounded by his lictors bearing the fasces that symbolized his absolute authority, came Cincinnatus himself, mounted on a white horse and wearing the purple-striped toga that marked him as dictator of the Roman people. The crowd's roar was deafening, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the 7 hills. "Cincinnatus," they cried, "Savior of the Republic, Father of the legions, greatest of Romans." The adulation was intoxicating, the kind of pure, unfiltered worship that had turned wiser men than he into tyrants and destroyers. For a moment, just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it would be like to hear that roar every day, to know that his word was law and his will was Rome's destiny. But then his eyes found a familiar face in the crowd, weathered and careworn but beautiful beyond description. Rasilia had come to Rome to witness her husband's triumph, leaving their farm in the care of neighbors to be present at this moment of glory. She stood among the cheering masses, her plain dress a sharp contrast to the elaborate togas around her, her quiet smile a reminder of values that had nothing to do with power or conquest. In her eyes, he saw not worship but love, not awe but understanding, not a dictator but the man who had shared her bed and table for 30 years. That night, as Rome celebrated with torch-lit processions and wine-fueled festivities, Cincinnatus sat quietly in his temporary residence, contemplating the scroll that would formalize his resignation from the dictatorship. The words were already composed in his mind, the legal formulae that would transfer his authority back to the consuls and restore the Republic's normal constitutional order. All that remained was to make the final decision to choose between the intoxicating certainty of absolute power and the quiet uncertainty of returning to private life. Around him, the sounds of celebration continued late into the night, a city-wide expression of joy and relief that seemed to make the very air vibrate with excitement. But gradually, as the wine flowed and the initial euphoria gave way to more thoughtful reflection, a different kind of conversation began to emerge from Rome's taverns and gathering places. Citizens who had witnessed the day's triumph found themselves asking questions that had not occurred to them in the heat of the moment. What would happen now that the crisis was over? Would their savior dictator prove as wise in peace as he had been effective in war? Some, remembering the Republic's history and the examples of other strong men who had been reluctant to surrender power once they had tasted its full measure, whispered concerns about the future. Others, intoxicated by the day's success and confident in Cincinnatus's character, dismissed such worries as the paranoid fantasies of those who could not appreciate true virtue when they saw it. But all understood, at some level, that they were living through a defining moment in Roman history, a test not just of one man's character, but of the Republic's fundamental values. In his private chamber, far from the crowds and the celebrations, Cincinnatus carefully prepared his resignation speech, choosing each word with the precision of a craftsman shaping fine metal. Tomorrow, he would stand before the Senate and people of Rome and do something that would either confirm his place among the Republic's greatest heroes or mark him as perhaps the most foolish man who had ever lived. He would voluntarily surrender power that others spent their entire lives trying to acquire, would choose obscurity over glory, would return to the plow when he could have kept the fasces. But as he worked by lamplight, occasionally glancing out at the torch-lit celebrations in the streets below, Cincinnatus felt not doubt, but a growing sense of peace. He had been tested by crisis and found not wanting. He had wielded absolute power and discovered that it was not corruption but responsibility, not license but duty. Now came the final test, the one that would determine whether he truly understood what it meant to serve the Republic rather than be served by it. Dawn was still hours away when he finished writing, setting aside the stylus and rolling up the parchment that would transform him from dictator back to citizen. Outside, the celebrations were finally winding down, Rome's citizens returning to their homes and their normal lives, perhaps not yet fully comprehending the historical significance of the day they had just witnessed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new crises, new tests of the Republic's strength and wisdom. But tonight, at least, Rome slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that her eagles flew triumphant and her sons were safely home. The Forum had never seemed so vast, so filled with history and expectation, as it did on the morning when Cincinnatus prepared to address the Senate and people of Rome for what he knew would be the last time as dictator. The early sun slanted through the columns of the temples that surrounded the sacred space, creating pools of golden light on the marble pavement where Roman feet had worn smooth paths over the centuries. Citizens had been gathering since before dawn, drawn by rumors and whispers of what their savior dictator might announce, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation, gratitude, and that peculiarly Roman anxiety that accompanied moments of great political significance. Senators arrived in their finest togas, the purple stripes of their rank catching the morning light as they took their places on the temporary benches that had been erected for this unprecedented gathering. These were the men who had debated for days before finally agreeing to invest Cincinnatus with absolute power, and who now waited to learn what he intended to do with the authority they had granted him. Some watched him with barely concealed nervousness, perhaps wondering if they had created a monster that would now devour the very system that had spawned it. Others observed with the calm confidence of those who believed they had chosen well, who trusted that virtue and wisdom would triumph over ambition and greed. The lictors, those ceremonial guards who carried the fasces that symbolized ultimate power, stood at rigid attention around the speaker's platform, their bronze-tipped rods gleaming in the morning light. These bundled rods, bound around an axe that represented the power of life and death, had been carried before Roman magistrates for centuries, but never had they seemed to weigh so heavily as they did in the hands of men who wondered if this might be the last day they would serve a republican government. Democracy was still a young experiment in the ancient world, and many of its practitioners understood just how fragile it could be when confronted with the appeal of strong leadership. Cincinnatus himself appeared calm, almost serene, as he mounted the speaker's platform that had been constructed for this momentous occasion. He wore the purple-striped toga of his office, but somehow it seemed to hang differently on his shoulders than it had just days before, not with the weight of power assumed, but with the dignity of duty about to be discharged. In his hands, he carried the scroll he had prepared the night before, its parchment containing words that would either elevate him to legendary status or mark him as the greatest fool in Roman history. "Citizens of Rome," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the forum, despite the multitude that had gathered to hear him speak. "Senators and people, soldiers and civilians, all who call themselves children of this eternal city, I stand before you today not as your ruler, but as your servant, not as your master, but as your fellow citizen, bound by the same laws, subject to the same duties, heir to the same hopes for our republic's future." A hush fell over the crowd, so complete that the only sounds were the whisper of wind through the temple columns and the distant cry of birds circling the 7 hills. Every person present understood that they were witnessing history, though none could yet predict exactly what form that history would take. Cincinnatus paused, allowing the silence to stretch, his eyes moving slowly across the sea of upturned faces, as if he were speaking to each citizen individually. "7 days ago," he continued, "you honored me with your trust and burdened me with your hopes by naming me dictator in your hour of greatest need. You placed in my hands the power to command armies, to make laws, to decide questions of life and death, to shape the very destiny of our republic. That power I accepted not because I desired it, but because duty demanded it, not because I was worthy of it, but because Rome required service from those able to provide it." As he spoke, Cincinnatus found himself remembering the journey that had brought him to this moment, from the quiet contentment of his farm to the desperate urgency of military crisis, from the terrifying responsibility of absolute power to the profound satisfaction of duty fulfilled. Each step had tested him in different ways, had required him to draw upon different aspects of his character, had forced him to choose between personal desire and public good. Now came the final choice, the one that would define not just his own legacy, but the Republic's understanding of what it meant to serve rather than be served. "The crisis that prompted my appointment has passed," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Our trapped legions have been rescued, our enemies defeated, our borders secured. The immediate threat to Roman security has been eliminated, and the Republic's military reputation has been not merely preserved but enhanced. The mission you gave me when you invested me with supreme authority has been completed successfully, with honor to our arms and mercy to our fallen enemies." A murmur ran through the crowd, part relief and part something else, a growing realization of what Cincinnatus might be preparing to announce. In the senatorial section, older legislators who remembered the Republic's earlier crises exchanged meaningful glances, while younger senators who had never witnessed such a moment, leaned forward in their seats, unwilling to miss a single word of what was clearly becoming a speech for the ages. Therefore, Cincinnatus continued, and now his voice carried the finality of absolute decision, I hereby resign the office of dictator, effective immediately upon the conclusion of this address. I return to the Senate and people of Rome all the powers you granted me, all the authority you placed in my keeping, all the responsibility for governing this republic that is yours by right and yours by heritage. Let the consuls resume their proper duties. Let the Senate deliberate as wisdom requires. Let the people choose their representatives as justice demands. Rome needs no dictator when Romans remember how to be citizens. The silence that followed these words was profound, charged with an electricity that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Then, as the full import of what they had just heard penetrated the consciousness of the crowd, an explosion of sound erupted from the forum that could be heard on the farthest reaches of the 7 hills. Citizens cheered and wept simultaneously. Senators applauded with tears streaming down their faces. Even the normally impassive lictors allowed smiles to crack their ceremonial composure. But Cincinnatus was not finished. Raising his hand for silence, he waited for the crowd's emotions to settle before delivering the words that would complete his transformation from dictator back to citizen. I return now to my farm, he said simply, to the life I love and the work that sustains both body and spirit. My wheat awaits harvesting, my soil requires tending. My wife deserves a husband who remembers that the greatest service any citizen can perform is to live honestly, work diligently, and raise his family in virtue. If Rome has need of me again, she knows where to find me behind the plow, where I belong. With those words, he began the physical ritual of resignation, handing over the symbols of his authority with the same precision he had once used to plant seeds in carefully measured rows. The fasces were returned to the lictors who served the regular magistrates, their bronze points and bundled rods seeming to lose some of their intimidating power as they passed from dictatorial to consular hands. The purple-striped toga of supreme office was exchanged for the simple white toga of a private citizen, a transformation that seemed to diminish Cincinnatus physically, even as it elevated him morally. The formal transfer of power took only minutes, but its significance would echo through centuries. Here, in full view of the Roman people, absolute power was being voluntarily surrendered by the very man who had proven most capable of wielding it effectively. It was a demonstration of civic virtue so pure, so unprecedented, that witnesses struggled to find words adequate to describe what they were seeing. Kings throughout the ancient world ruled by divine right and held their thrones until death or defeat removed them. Tyrants seized power through violence and maintained it through fear. But here was something entirely new. A man who took power reluctantly, used it effectively, and surrendered it gladly. As the ceremony concluded, and Cincinnatus stepped down from the speaker's platform, now just another citizen among citizens. The crowd began to disperse with the slow, almost dreamlike movements of people who had witnessed something that challenged their understanding of human nature itself. Conversations erupted throughout the forum as Romans tried to process what they had just seen, their voices reflecting wonder, admiration, and perhaps a touch of the bewilderment that comes when reality exceeds the bounds of imagination. But Cincinnatus had no time for lingering or basking in the crowd's adulation. His wheat was indeed ready for harvest, and every day of delay risked losing portions of the crop that would feed his family through the coming winter. With the same efficiency he had shown in organizing military campaigns, he gathered his few possessions, bid farewell to the senators and officials who had served under his command, and prepared for the journey back to the life he had temporarily abandoned. The road from Rome to his farm had never seemed so welcoming. Each familiar landmark a promise of peace restored and normal life resumed. Rucilia was waiting for him at their gate, her face radiant with a joy that had nothing to do with public triumph and everything to do with private love. She had watched the resignation ceremony from the crowd, had seen her husband choose her and their quiet life over all the glittering temptations of power, and now she welcomed him home with the quiet satisfaction of a woman whose faith had been vindicated by events. "How does it feel?" she asked as they walked together through fields that seemed to glow with golden promise in the afternoon light. "To be the most famous man in Rome one day and just a farmer the next." Cincinnatus paused to examine a head of wheat, testing its readiness with fingers that had grown soft during his brief absence from agricultural labor. "It feels," he said after a moment's consideration, "like coming home. Power is a tool, useful when circumstances require it, but dangerous when it becomes an end in itself. I have used that tool, put it back where it belongs, and returned to work that creates rather than commands. Tomorrow, when I wake with the sun and walk these furrows with my hands in honest soil, I will be richer than any king who ever lived." The harvest that followed was perhaps the most satisfying of Cincinnatus's life, each bundle of grain cut and gathered by hands that had recently held the power of life and death over millions of people. Neighbors came to help, as was the custom during harvest time, but they came with a new respect for the man who had saved Rome and then chosen to return to their simple way of life. Children who had played in these fields before now did so with the awareness that they were walking ground made sacred by the presence of a living legend. Yet Cincinnatus himself seemed unchanged by his brush with ultimate power, approaching the work of harvest with the same methodical care he had always shown, the same attention to detail that wasted no grain and overlooked no corner of his modest domain. He rose with the sun, worked through the heat of midday, and rested only when darkness made further labor impossible. His hands, which had grown soft during his week as dictator, quickly developed new calluses as they readjusted to the honest work of agriculture. As word of his resignation spread throughout the Mediterranean world, reactions varied according to the cultural perspectives of those who heard the tale. In the kingdoms of the East, where power was considered a divine gift never to be surrendered, the story was dismissed as Roman propaganda, too incredible to be believed. In Greece, where philosophy had begun to explore questions of virtue and governance, thinkers nodded approvingly and cited Cincinnatus as proof that their theoretical ideals could actually be lived by real men in the real world. Among Rome's enemies, the tale created a mixture of respect and confusion. How could they fight an empire led by men who valued honor more than advancement? But perhaps most importantly, within Rome itself, Cincinnatus's example began to reshape the Republic's understanding of what it meant to serve in public office. Future magistrates would measure themselves against his standard, asking not what they could gain from power, but what they could give to their fellow citizens. The office of dictator, which had always been viewed with suspicion as a necessary evil in times of crisis, acquired a new dignity from his example, becoming a position that attracted the virtuous rather than the ambitious. Seasons passed, as seasons do, indifferent to human ambition, yet intimately connected to human survival. Cincinnatus aged gracefully, his hair whitening and his step slowing, but his essential character remaining as solid as the foundations of Rome itself. Visitors came occasionally to his farm, historians seeking to record his story, philosophers hoping to understand his motivations, young politicians looking for guidance in their own careers. He received them all with courtesy, but always returned to his central theme. True service required no audience. Virtue needed no reward beyond the satisfaction of duty performed. Years later, when storytellers began to embellish his tale and artists started creating idealized portraits of the farmer dictator, Cincinnatus would smile quietly and return to his work. Let others debate the meaning of his actions or argue about the lessons to be drawn from his example. He knew what he had done and why he had done it, and he found that knowledge sufficient for any man's peace of mind. He had planted good seed in fertile soil, had tended it with care and patience, had harvested it at the proper time, and had shared the fruits with those who needed sustenance. Whether that seed was grain or virtue seemed less important than the planting itself. The end, when it came, was as peaceful as his life had been purposeful. Cincinnatus died in his sleep on a winter night, with Recilia beside him and the sound of wind through his beloved fields as his final earthly music. He was buried according to Roman custom, without ostentation but with the profound respect due to one who had lived his principles rather than merely professing them. His gravestone bore no titles, claimed no victories, recorded no honors, simply his name and the dates of his birth and death, as if he had been any other Roman citizen rather than the man who had redefined what Roman citizenship could mean. But the story lived on, passed from generation to generation as an example of what was possible when power met virtue, when strength encountered wisdom, when the temptations of glory were weighed against the deeper satisfactions of service. Cincinnatus became more than a man. He became a symbol, a standard against which future leaders would be measured, a reminder that true greatness lay not in acquiring power, but in knowing when to surrender it. In the centuries that followed, as Rome grew from republic to empire to legend, the name of Cincinnatus would be invoked whenever citizens needed to remember what their ancestors had once aspired to be. School children would memorize his story, learning that virtue was not weakness, and that the highest honor came not from ruling others, but from mastering oneself. Generals would think of him before accepting promotions that might lead them away from their true calling. Farmers would work their fields with a little more pride, knowing that their honest labor connected them to one of Rome's greatest heroes. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and families gathered to share their simple meals, parents would tell their children about the man who saved Rome with his sword and then saved it again with his wisdom, who showed the world that true strength lay not in grasping power, but in letting it go when duty was complete. The tale would end, as all good stories do, with the peaceful sleep of virtue rewarded and duty fulfilled, with the eternal promise that such examples, once set, could never truly die. Thus ends the story of Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus, reluctant dictator and willing farmer, who in 16 days of absolute rule established a standard of civic virtue that would endure as long as human beings remembered the difference between power and service, between ruling and leading, between what we desire and what we deserve. His plow rests now in history's fields, but the furrows he carved in human consciousness remain as fresh as morning, as enduring as the seasons, as eternal as the hope that good men and women will always choose duty over glory when their moment of testing arrives. Sleep now and dream of grain fields golden in the sun, of honest work honestly done, of power accepted reluctantly and surrendered gladly, of a world where the greatest among us understand that their greatness lies not in what they can take, but in what they can give. Sleep and rest in the knowledge that virtue, once planted, grows eternal harvests for all who have the wisdom to gather its fruit.